eminent social activist, Dr. Ram Punyani, and I request him to welcome us and speak a few words.
Good evening, friends. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all on this Asghar Ali Engineer Memorial Lecture by the eminent social scientist, Dr. Suhas Palshikar. Now, just to speak a bit about my guru and friend, Asghar Ali Engineer. He was a multifaceted person, totally committed to social change. And there may be a formal biographies on him which may come out, but his major contribution which I see, major in the today's context which I see, was recognizing very early that communalism is a problem in India. That time hardly many social groups were there who were trying to focus on the issue of this divisive communal politics. When Dr. Engineer, after doing his graduation in engineering, he was an engineer, of course, really engineer, he took upon himself to first try to understand the nature of communal violence. And it was a great observation on his part that this communal violence has nothing to do with religion. It's a political trick by some forces in the society who want to use religion to get power, to divide society, and to have a different type of agenda. As such, formally speaking, as they say, charity begins at home. First thing he focused was to do the reform work within his own sub-community within Muslims. And that is a long struggle for Bohra reforms within Bohra community. I must tell you that it was this reform process due to which he was attacked for 5 times. Once, of course, by that time I had started associating, and Irfan and myself, we went to receive him at the airport. At Indore, he was attacked by those goons, and he came quite bleeding and all that at the airport. Same time, his house and his office, both were attacked. And in house, there are so many multiple editions of Quran which were destroyed in that particular attack. Of course, still Irfan and Sandhya maintain that home library also very well. It's a matter of pride for us. So Bohra reform, then investigation of communal violence, then trying to bring an understanding about communalism in India, how it developed, its genesis, freedom movement, Kashmir, partition, all those things which, of course, I was so impressed that I used to visit the office, his office, and used to come across this. So I won't go into the details of the vast nature of his work, the prolific writing, and the in-depth, very, very in-depth study of things. Meanwhile, of course, today, later on, after 9/11, 2001, the phenomenon of terrorism, which was wrongly labeled as Islamic terrorism, came up. But Dr. Engineer, through his very deep study of Quran, he learned Arabic, read Quran in original, and his commentaries on this issue are recognized all over the world as a great Islamic scholar. One more thing was that he was not an armchair writer. While writing also, he was continuously involved in the social issues, traveling and all that. So the last point which, of course, I learned from him was about the analysis of various issues. And one last point which took up towards the end of his writing career was the gender issues. Gender issues, very close to his heart. And he came out with brilliant books on on gender and Islam. So this is his writings, which of course are very profound. And somehow with this, the story of CSSS and Dr. Engineer's biography, they run parallel. He started getting involved. First he formed a group called Ekta. Ekta was the first group even with which I also got associated. And the idea of Ekta was that this communalism issue, it should reach, its awareness should reach to different people, and especially trade unions and other people. They should protest against what is going on in the name of communal violence. Especially I remember after demolition of Babri Mosque, when I also woke up in a way to the issue of communalism. I heard that he has an office somewhere in Santa Cruz. I went to attend the office, and that time there was no space of sitting in the office. He was sitting in the middle of the room, and all people were surrounding, trying to form the strategy for relief, rehabilitation, and prevention of further escalation of violence. So our CSSS was culmination of this whole process of engagement with society on the issue of communalism. And as it was formed, things started getting more formalized. Apart from, of course, the 50, 60, 70% of the work was done by Dr. Engineer himself, like his fortnightly issues in secular politics, then his monthly issues on Islam, that some of these still continue. And communal violence work done by our center has been fairly unique. So to add to this, other activities got added, like taking workshops of teachers, taking workshops of activists, 5-day workshop, 3-day workshop, 2-day workshop, lot of these things we carried on. And this was all when he was very much the mentor and guide for the center. After his sad demise, due to unfortunate circumstances, mainly he was least caring about himself. The last trip which I undertook with him was towards Amritsar, to Amritsar, where both of us were to speak in a gathering. And I, of course, I hope you know, I am a doctor also. So I was surprised that he was having a gross cellulitis in leg. And cellulitis is fairly dangerous thing. But he said, I have been invited, I have to go. So Sandhya, his daughter-in-law and my close friend, she insisted upon him not to overexert, not to do this. But about his commitment, he was rock solid. So anyway, with these activities were already there, workshops, then journal came out on secularism. His fortnightly writings were already there. After his demise, the new team which came up, new means partly, actually it was the same team minus the greatest amongst us. So we first of all thought of peace centers. Why CSSS should be there in Bombay only? We should try to open peace centers in different places, and which I am happy to inform the audience that my colleagues Irfan and Neha are wonderfully managing, and some of the peace centers are doing great particular activities. Same way was added this morning harmony walks, means college students are there, you take them for a walk and try to explain them different places which are there and which things can be explained. And lately, of course, the center has also been a place, Center for Study of Society and Secularism has also been a place where all those who are very committed to the idea of secularism, progressive values, and of course India's constitutions, liberty, equality, fraternity, it has become sort of a center for many of us to meet and deliberate and to see that how our ideas can be taken to the society. That is the biggest challenge of society. And that how Dr. Engineer began, I will begin with a small anecdote that even before the time of this social media, YouTubes, Dr. Engineer's writing was going on as regular as possible. So one day morning, we were in Kalina campus for a small seminar. So as usual, Dr. Engineer was there. I reached, and we both were trying to enjoy the sunshine. Then one of the speakers came in the taxi. He paid the taxi person, but taxi person, after receiving the payment, he got down from the taxi and he came headed straight towards Dr. Engineer. So I was surprised why he should be coming to Dr. Engineer. He came, touched Dr. Engineer's feet, folded his hand and said, "Sir, please carry on doing what you are doing. It gives us a great amount of hope and enlightenment." I was very deeply touched by that particular moment in this thing. And today, continuing in the same light, that knowledge is not just for books, seminars, and lectures. These awareness has to be reached to the people. And today, particularly when the social common sense is totally vitiated, all these myths about religious minorities, Muslims, Christians, and whole distortion of our freedom movement. There are so many things which they keep creating day in and day out. You see Assam, you see Bengal, you see selective focus on Bengal's rape case while ignoring all the other things. All these things, I think, need to be combated. This is the message of Dr. Engineer, to my understanding, and also our center. The idea is to reach these simple awareness in the language, like to act as a bridge between scholars. Like, of course, India has no dearth of scholars. I am very proud to say that. But question is, how this knowledge essence reaches the average people. That is a big task which we have to carry on as inheriting the values of Dr. Asghar Engineer. So in the same light, of course, I must say, today we are standing at a very crucial time in the history, as everybody says all the time. But whether democracy will survive or not depends on this, whether Dr. Engineer's mission of reaching these things to the average people, acting as a bridge between the scholars and the people on the street, that I think is the biggest challenge, in the line of which we also started this Asghar Ali Engineer Memorial Lectures. They are not just to commemorate his memory, he is always in our hearts, but they are also to ensure that new findings, research, social sciences, and the political thing by authorities in those subjects are presented to the people, and we try to propagate those values as much as possible. Thank you very much.
As most of you must be aware, unfortunately, yesterday we lost another gem, that is A.J. Noorani, and we know that he was a tall scholar. So if we can maintain 1 minute silence in his memory. Thank you. Yes, with no further ado, I think we have been looking forward to this lecture. And it's my absolute pleasure to call upon a very eminent panel that we have today, starting with the speaker who will be delivering this lecture, Suhas Palshikar. And it's my great honor to introduce him, though he needs no introduction. We have read him through various articles, through newspaper columns, and he has inspired us with his ideas and knowledge. But I will try to do justice to this Herculean task assigned to me. Professor Suhas Palshikar has taught political science from 1978 to 2016. He is honorary co-director of Lokniti, a research program on comparative democracy, CSDS Delhi, and chief editor of Lokniti's biannual journal brought out by SAGE, Studies in Indian Politics. He is also editor of Samaj Prabodhan Patrika during 1990 to 2004. Suhas Palshikar is associated with National Election Study since 1996 elections. He has also been involved in various research projects of Lokniti, focusing on study of public opinion in India. Professor Palshikar was one of the principal investigators of the international project on democracy in South Asia. Professor Palshikar writes in English and Marathi on contemporary Indian politics and has also written extensively in academic publications on the theme of democratic politics in India. He has been frequent contributor to the Indian Express and journals like Seminar and EPW. His Marathi books include Rajya Shastra Kosh, Maharashtrati Satta Sangarsha, Rajkarnachi Taliban, Desh Pradesh. Professor Palshikar's latest publications include the books The Last Fortress of Congress Dominance, Maharashtra since 1990s, Politics and Society Between Elections, The Expanding Role of Majoritarianism in India, Caste, Class and Vote Consolidation of the Privileged and Dispersal of the Underprivileged. He has also been co-editor of the SAGE series on politics in Indian states. Some of his other works include Indian Democracy and co-edited volumes of Electoral Politics in India, Resurgence of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and Party Competition in Indian states. So with that, we welcome Professor Suhas Palshikar on the dais. And we have an equally eminent chair today, and we are very fortunate to have him. That is Mr. Kumar Ketkar, who is a writer, politician, and former journalist. He was the chief editor of Dainik Divya Marathi. He has started his journalistic career with the Economic Times. He has been the editor-in-chief of the Marathi newspaper Lok Satta. He has also worked with the Observer and the Maharashtra Time. And needless to say that he has been a very, very critical journalist who has taken up issues that matter the most. He has written on various topics over the years and also provided media coverage to the 8 presidential elections in the US since 1988, collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, integration of Germany in 1992, integration of Hong Kong with China in 1997. He was India coordinator for the South Asian Free Media Association, which was a Mumbai-Karachi forum, founder of the literary movement Granthali, along with the other literary activists. And of course, he has won several prestigious awards for journalistic excellence as the Indian Affairs Transformational Journalist of the Decade at the 9th Annual India Leadership Conclave and Awards 2018 in Mumbai, founded by journalist Satya Brahma. And he has various books published, Jwalamukhीचा Tondavar, Katha Swatantrachi, and others. With that, I also welcome Kumar Ketkar ji on the dais. And I also invite on the dais Advocate Irfan Engineer, who is the director at the Center for Study of Society and Secularism. And I think I will now request the speaker to deliver his lecture.
Chairperson of the lecture this evening, Shri Kumar Ketkar, Dr. Ram Punyani, Chairperson of the CSSS, Advocate Irfan Engineer, and friends in the audience. It's indeed a great pleasure to be amongst you this evening, particularly to speak in the memory of Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer, someone who grew up reading his reports on communal riots in the EPW in particular. It has been a great honor to speak in his memory. I cannot claim that I was personally very close to him as such, but the few occasions when I interacted with him, sat in front of him particularly at Satara, for example, when the Ambedkar Academy of Kishore Bedkehal would invite him to speak. And it was at that time that he was, in a sense, beyond the question of only communalism and thinking in terms of how religion should be understood. That was also the time when he would consistently emphasize the fact how religion needs to be reread in the present context. And as Dr. Ram Punyani said, he was himself a scholar of Islam, and from that point of authority, he would tell us what Islam meant, and therefore what Islam didn't mean, And in that exposition, one would also get a sense that it is not a question of only a literal reading of a text, but also understanding of religion, of religious scriptures, and basically understanding of what we do of religion in our contemporary lives. So it was a great learning, and indeed a great pleasure, therefore, to speak in his memory here. So I thank you all, but thank you in particular, CSSS and Irfan, for inviting me for this lecture. Friends, I suppose that like Irfan, some of you also may be intrigued by the title of the lecture. So let me clarify right at the beginning what I plan to do and then go ahead with the lecture. Roughly a year ago, or exactly a year ago, I wrote in one of my Indian Express columns on this question of using bulldozers, and thought that it was becoming almost as an instrument of governance increasingly. And in the year intervening from that time to today, we have been witnessing that perhaps more repeatedly as to how bulldozers are used. But I want to dwell mainly in this lecture on the larger meaning of this use of bulldozers, and then turn to the question whether we as citizens demand the use of bulldozers so much that governments are pressed to using bulldozers, or is it that the political system is supplying and creating a demand for the use of bulldozers. And that's why this question of demand and supply, and at the end then, I would turn to the broader question of what it means, not only to Indian democracy as such, but also to the larger questions of the relationship between state and democracy. Irfan was telling me that there might be some benefit if I intermittently also spoke in Marathi. I will try to do that with the risk that it will break the flow of the presentation. And maybe if there is time for questions and answers, I would be too happy to also answer your questions in Marathi. It is a paradox that we should begin with. The paradox is, on the one hand, we have the Constitution of India, which tells us and promises us that there would be a government which would be constrained, limited in a number of ways, by rules, by procedures, by norms, but more importantly by the politics, that we in India would have a politics of such a kind, which is a legacy of our freedom struggle, that the governments in the country, and therefore state as an institution, will not exceed their brief. They will always be remaining within the confines of certain limitations. Paradoxically, however, in contrast to this constitutional promise and premise, we also have the reality, not just today, not just past 10 years, but consistently, that the Indian state has overstepped, come out of this constitutional limitation and treated citizens with contempt and their rights with equal contempt. So here is the paradox which lies behind the contemporary use of bulldozers. So while we critique the contemporary use of bulldozers, we also must be aware of this long-standing paradox, that this is already embryonically happening for the past so many years, that in contrast to the Constitution's promise, governments in this country and those who run the government's persons and the elite more generally have treated the ideas of constitution, constraint, rights and citizens with contempt. It is this paradox which is probably more dramatically manifested by the exercise of bulldozers that we witness these days. Bulldozers are not really unknown to citizens. Particularly if you are a poor person in this country, you know what bulldozers mean. If you are a slum dweller in this country, you know what bulldozers mean. But at the same time, we rarely come across situations where governments use bulldozers with complete impunity and lack of restraint. Probably the only historical example that would come to your mind, and many of here perhaps, is the Turkman Gate bulldozer incidents. But that was, in a sense, politically punished subsequently and was roundly criticized and goes into the history of India as a black day in the democratic history of this country. In spite of that, we come to 2017, and 2017 is, in a sense, a time when the proclamation of New India was made by the Prime Minister of the country after the victory of his party in the Uttar Pradesh Assembly election. So after having declared that we are now ushering in New India, in this New India suddenly, the state of Uttar Pradesh started using bulldozers, ostensibly on the ground that there are criminals, law and order situation in Uttar Pradesh is bad, it needs to be treated with a strong hand, hence bulldozers. Against whom? Against whoever is suspected of being responsible for the law and order situation in that state. So Uttar Pradesh, in a sense, was the starting point, but let us not really blame Uttar Pradesh alone, because following Uttar Pradesh and its footsteps, many states started doing the same thing. Probably the most ardent follower of Uttar Pradesh in this question of use of bulldozers has been Madhya Pradesh, which is still in the news even as we speak and talk today. In June itself, 37 incidents of bulldozer use to demolish houses of so-called criminals, opponents, protesters, etc. occurred. This is from the reports that we can find out. Irfan has already asked me to give this script in writing when I would supply the necessary references as well. So it's not that it is from my own mind that I'm talking of these numbers. More recently, of course, on the ground that somebody has an illegal construction, bulldozer has been used in Madhya Pradesh. Overall, and let us not go into these details because they are generally similar everywhere, the first point of use of bulldozers is usually on the question of encroachments. Though in Uttar Pradesh, it was also using bulldozers against the property of those who are suspected criminals, mafia perhaps, those who are participating in riots, those who are protesters, who protest against the government. So gradually from suspected criminals and encroachers, the subjects of these encroachments and bulldozer actions happen to be protesters, dissenters, opponents of the sitting government, and so on and so forth. Not to be left behind, Haryana and Assam have also joined in this procession of bulldozers, where both the high courts, the Guwahati High Court and the Punjab and Haryana High Court, actually passed severe strictures against them. In one instance in Haryana, the Punjab and Haryana High Court not only stayed the action, but also asked a question, do you want to engage in ethnic cleansing? That was a straightforward question, though, of course, such questions which courts ask are not part of their rulings, and therefore they only have some kind of a poetic value, nothing more than that. Even then, this is significant that at least 2 high courts have found fault with such use of bulldozers. The Guwahati High Court in fact said that with such use of bulldozers, nobody is safe. That is what the Guwahati High Court said, again in passing. In Gujarat, and this is the statement by the Home Minister, under the leadership of our Chief Minister, more than 100 mazars were destroyed, demolished. Maharashtra couldn't be left behind because it is a progressive state. So recently, in Maharashtra also, in January, when there were communal flare-ups in Mumbai on the occasion of the consecration of the Ram temple at Ayodhya, bulldozers were used. Later on, in a very different context, when somebody was supposed to be a drug peddler in Pune, the Thane Municipal Corporation went into an overdrive using bulldozers against suspected drug peddler restaurants, in the process of which some pan stalls were also destroyed. And giving face to this police action, or not police action really, municipal action in Thane, the chief minister in fact announced that I have ordered the administration to take strong action against all drug peddlers. So you have a list of drug peddlers. You of course don't need any judicial process. You just go and destroy their properties. In the process of this destruction of properties, Frontline's cover story recently has pointed out as to how many thousand people actually became homeless. So I may be a criminal. As a punishment of that, my relatives and family would be rendered houseless if you demolish the house which supposedly belongs to me or where I live or whatever. This, in a sense, is the crucial question as to how does this process of bulldozer governance happen. And the answer is, in a sense, very simple, which is that it happens at the discretion of the executive authority concerned. The police, the municipal authorities, the ministers, the MLAs, whoever wields authority there would order and bulldozers would be used. One would think that if a high-rise is to be demolished, there would be a long legal battle involving whether it is illegal or not. Courts would be involved, and ultimately you will have perhaps occasionally a bulldozer action. In these instances that I have been listing and reading about so far, there has never been any prior judicial approval for these actions, not even routine procedure of issuing notices was adopted in most of the cases. So that is where we come as far as actual bulldozers are concerned. So bulldozer governance, in a sense, means that executives use bulldozers against whoever they want without any proper procedure. This is extra legal and excessive use of executive authority. त्यामुळे बुलडोझरचा वापर किंवा बुलडोझर पद्धतीचा कारभार, शासन व्यवहार याचा एक भाग हा झाला की कोणत्याही प्रकारच्या प्रोसिजरल प्रक्रियात्मक मर्यादा न पाळता, न्यायालयांची पत्रास न बाळगता, मुख्यतः गरीब, अल्पसंख्याक, विरोधक, निषेध करणारे किंवा कथित गुंड आणि गुन्हेगार यांच्या प्रॉपर्टीजच्या विरोधात बुलडोझर वापरला जाणं. पण माझा मुद्दा असा आहे की हा फक्त बुलडोझरच्या वापराचा प्रश्न आहे का? तर मी जे पुढे सांगणार आहे त्याप्रमाणे आपल्याला याच्या पलीकडे जाऊन बुलडोझर नावाचं रूपक वापरायला पाहिजे. द बेस्ट आयडिया टू अंडरस्टँड दिस फिनॉमिनन ऑफ बुलडोझर गव्हर्नन्स would be not to stop at bulldozer uses per se, just as bulldozers. Of course, bulldozers have been used, and therefore, if you were in the business of having bulldozers, you would do good business with the government. But let us move ahead and try to imagine bulldozer as an analogy. What is the analogy here? Bulldozer as an analogy means that somebody exceeds the brief, goes beyond the given authority, uses authority illegally, and applies that authority particularly against vulnerable sections or political opponents. Understood in this fashion, we might start asking questions whether bulldozer governance is confined only to the executive, and that to petty executive. Not just petty, we have already seen chief ministers being involved in the ordering and justification of bulldozer governance. But more than that, the real question is, can we imagine the use of bulldozer as an analogy and think of governments doing things which they are not authorized to do? Today we are talking of bulldozers, but earlier, much earlier and even today, encounter was its pet cousin, you can say. Encounters happen and then suspected criminals get killed. As late as in 2019, we had this dramatic instance of encounters in Hyderabad, where the police supposedly killed the rape suspects in an encounter during recreation of the crime. Now you might ask, what is this funny and tragic thing, recreation of a rape crime in the first place? But that is what they were doing, and nobody has asked that question that time, as to do you recreate a rape crime? What nonsense is this? But nobody asked that question. They were killed in broad daylight and were garlanded also. Subsequently, as we know, the Supreme Court appointed a panel to inquire into it, but as it happens with all such inquiry panels, it has been forgotten. So in the annals of police bravery, here is a police force that kills rapists. Whether they were rapists or not, no questions asked. If the police have decided they are rapists, they are rapists. And the police decide that the punishment is killing them. So the police become the judge and the police become the executioner and kill them. It has been ages since governance decided that it should be distributed and organized along functions as legislative, executive, judicial. And we are combining them today now and asking the police to be the complainant, the adjudicator, the executioner, everything. That panel appointed by the Supreme Court, incidentally, in 2022 recommended that since this was blatantly an illegal killing, all those police involved in this should be taken action against. But our media, which flashed the garlanding of the police, has no time and patience to find out whether that has actually happened. Because police, being police in the government service, would have certain protections, and therefore cases would drag on till their retirement, where people would die in encounters. Where does this power come from? This power, in a sense, comes from the idea that government has the final authority. So if the executive arrogates that authority to itself, then you can imagine what the legislature would be doing, because after all, the legislature is elected by the people. So the legislature would say that, look, we are elected, we can do and make laws as we want. That is legislative variant of bulldozer governance. And India, while we talk of executive governance through bulldozers, has also a strong element of legislative element of bulldozer governance. There is a long history to that, unfortunately. As I said initially in the mentioning of the paradox, the Indian state has always thought that it is the boss, and therefore has always tried to take up as much authority as possible. But to look at the recent context, since we are talking of the past 10 years or so, we can go back maybe another couple of decades and find out what is happening to this legislative variance of bulldozer governance. That has a context, and why I'm going back to, let's say, 25, 30 years, in the 80s. Because it was in the 1980s when this animal called terrorism was invented by American intelligentsia. Once they invented this animal called terrorism, think tanks everywhere in the world started saying that strong laws are necessary to tackle terrorism. Ordinary laws are not enough. In a sense, this is a defeat of democratic form of government, that ordinary laws are not enough and you need extraordinary laws. In India, post-Khalistan, this idea that terrorism is hovering around and we suddenly need extra laws to handle terrorism captured the imagination of our policymakers. And thus, from 1987 onwards, we have a spate of such laws emerging in the country. TADA, that was 1987, Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act, which was subsequently, of course, withdrawn. Then post 9/11 came the second moment of this realization that there is global terrorism, because since America says that there is global terrorism, then there must be global terrorism surely. And if there is global terrorism and United States is also passing strong laws, because they passed strong laws then we must pass strong laws ourselves. So POTA, Prevention of Terrorism Act. The Congress opposed it and subsequently then repealed that act when it came to power under the UPA government. But POTA was the second such large example of legislative bulldozer governance. The UAPA already existed, and that's why I said that this penchant that we need to have special laws is not new. However, if you look at the amendments, which are the jarring amendments of the UAPA, they have come more recently in 2004, 2008, and 2019. These are the three jarring amendments to the UAPA, as a result of which UAPA now sits almost on a pedestal, not an ordinary law at all. Finally, and nothing to do with directly terrorism, but the cunning of the state, as the philosophers would call it, is such that the next law that I am going to mention is also in the arguments in the court connected with the idea of terrorism, and that is PMLA 2002, Prevention of Money Laundering Act. So you launder the money, you take away the money and pay the terrorists. That's now the cunning of the state that is being argued in the course of law. If you look at all these laws, and I'm not a legal expert, so I will not go into the details, but you know the details generally from what you can read about them, is that they give extraordinary powers of arrest, less powers to the judiciary to intervene, and in some cases, and I will mention this again if time permits later, you are guilty till proven innocent. Now this is something of a new variant. This is a new discovery of Indian jurisprudence, because ordinary jurisprudence says that you are innocent till proven guilty. तुम्ही जोपर्यंत दोषी आहात हे सिद्ध नाही होत तोपर्यंत तुम्ही निरपराध आहात असं मानणं हा कायद्याचा आणि एकूण न्याय प्रक्रियेचा गाभा समजला जायचा. PMLA नंतर जे ज्युरिस्प्रुडन्स चाललेलं आहे त्याच्यात एकूण रंग असा आहे की तुम्ही जोपर्यंत सिद्ध होत नाही की तुम्ही निरपराध आहात तोपर्यंत तुम्ही अपराधी आहात. आणि कोण सिद्ध करणार तुम्ही निरपराध आहात हे? अर्थातच तुम्ही स्वतः. सरकार काही तुम्ही निरपराध आहात हे सिद्ध करायला येणार नाही. ॲज ए पार्टी अरेस्टिंग यू, the state is not going to prove that you are innocent. So the burden of proof, as they call it in jurisprudence, is on the accused. So that is how a complete turnaround has taken place legislatively, and that is why I thought that this bulldozer governance analogy should not stop merely as the actual use of bulldozers. Many of these things have happened in last 10-15 years, but more specifically in the last 10 years, state governments have intervened to pass laws. So these laws are, of course, laws which govern the large question of terrorism. But organized crime is something that states handle, or don't handle really, but they have the capacity to pass laws, and therefore various laws about organized crime have been passed by state governments. But that is not all. Other laws passed by the state governments of late in the last 10 years include, for example, if you want a test of it, something that didn't become a law, at least for the moment, is the Public Safety Act that the government of Maharashtra wanted to bring about, the Public Safety Bill 2014. And Maharashtra government is not very, you may say, original, because most of the provisions of the this public safety draft were lifted from a similar act which is already in existence in Chhattisgarh. So it is already there. And you are just lifting them from here and saying that we want to give Jana Suraksha. That law, funnily but tragically, also uses terms such as urban and Nakshal. Because some film personality writes a book, suddenly urban and Nakshal have become legal categories and the government is using them in the draft bill. Not even knowing, for example, that scholars no more use the term Nakshal, they use the term Maoist instead. And even among them, there are varieties and varieties of who are the Maoists, good, bad, ugly, all sorts of Maoists. But you use terms which are in a sense lifted from the book written by somebody and start transposing them into the draft bill in order to give Suraksha to the Jana. Jana Suraksha Bill, that was the name of the bill. Then there are acts passed by many state governments governing conversion, cow slaughter, and the sale of beef and related things. These are matters under the state list. States have passed laws. They are all so wide-ranging in their provisions that practically the police can arrest anyone on the ground of suspicion of having lured somebody to convert into some other religion. Just because somebody writes a book or publishes a film called Love Jihad, you start saying that it is actually happening. And Maharashtra actually has a committee sitting on this question of inter-religious marriages. In other words, it is this narrowing of the larger question of how people should interact with each other, how police should govern or how police should not govern, what are the constraints that the judiciary should impose. Everything has been thrown to the winds, and therefore we now actually have entered into the era of bulldozer governance, not just because bulldozers are used, so nobody's house needs to be bulldozed, but they can be arrested, and they can be arrested on any of these charges that we have been listing so far: terrorism, money laundering, conversion, cow slaughter, sale purchase of cows, business in brief, and so on and so forth. So there are a set of union laws and a set of state laws, both of which combine into a legislative terror created by this bulldozer governance. You may ask a question that India being a democracy, aren't there any checks and balances? The theoretical checks and balances obviously come from the legislature itself checking the executive. But here we have instances where legislatures are going overboard and passing these laws. And therefore, legislatures exercising restraint on the executive is almost a rarity now. It is unlikely to happen anymore. The way our parties are organized, the way ruling parties are controlled everywhere, and the way the Anti-Defection Act has been understood means that legislatures simply can't control the executive anymore. This myth that in a parliamentary democracy legislature controls the executive has already been discarded in India theoretically and judicially by the Anti-Defection Act. And remember, the Anti-Defection Act was passed by, I remember, by consensus. Nobody opposed it, though from outside, Madhu Limay had warned that this is, in a sense, a devastating development, which it has happened. The other check probably institutionally should come from the judiciary. But barring the couple of instances that I mentioned, Guwahati High Court and Punjab and Haryana High Court in one instance each, the judiciary either has not been called upon to intervene, or has refused to intervene, or has ducked simply, has not done anything. And we will speak more about the judiciary later. So, in a sense, this bulldozer governance has become possible because of the collusion between the executive and the legislature on the one hand, and a complete sidelining of the judiciary as a control mechanism, as a regulatory mechanism in the field of governance or in the question of power asymmetry. To say the least, because I will say more about the judiciary later, so to say the least about the judiciary at this point, the approach of the judiciary to bulldozer governance has generally been indulgent. प्रेमाने सहन करण्याची एकूण न्यायपालिकेची वृत्ती या कायद्यांच्या आणि बुलडोजर गव्हर्नन्सच्या बाबतीत राहिलेली आहे, इंडल्जन्स. सो द क्वेश्चन देन इज, how is this all happening suddenly? 20 years ago maybe, post Mandal 1990, at least in my subject political science, oh, democracy is alive and kicking, there are new forces coming up, etc., etc. In fact, we were then talking about how democracy might now be deepening, and instead of that, suddenly a reversal has happened. So the question is, how is this happening? The usual culprit, of course, is we, the people. So the usual answer to this question, how is this happening, is that, oh, people demand it. If you ask any MLA or minister in private or probably even in public, they will say, there is public pressure on us and therefore we need to take strong action. If you ask them about bulldozer governance, they would say, what can we do? The situation is bad, crime is organized, police are helpless, they don't have good weapons, and therefore we need strong action because as elected representatives, we have to face public pressure. Partly true, because in our minds as citizens, there is always a wild person residing in us. This wild person wants instant justice. When we see something wrong happening, we want instant punishment. That's one. Secondly, it is true that criminal justice system in this country is so complicated and dilapidated that often things don't happen the way they are expected to happen in the books. There are occasionally, for example, cases like Dimapur in Nagaland, where people got so angry that they actually broke a jail, drew out a criminal and killed him to death. This is 2015 Dimapur jailbreak. Much earlier, 20 years ago, in Nagpur, in the court premises, in the infamous Akku Yadav case, women stormed the court premises and snatched away this criminal from the police and killed him, and it went on to become a kind of folklore of mob justice. Such things happen, they happen out of desperation, they happen out of exasperation. The question is, do therefore people in their sane minds, when they are away from these very disturbing developments, really endorse bulldozer governance? That really should be the question. If we start asking this question and finding out if there is any evidence for that, we find limited evidence for this argument that people want or demand bulldozer justice. The way I have now expanded the idea of bulldozer justice, let us say that it incorporates these two elements. One, strong leader, the image of a strong leader, and two, related to that, a leader unrestrained by procedures. These are at the heart of bulldozer justice or bulldozer governance. So, let me run you through some data. 20 years ago, in one of our studies, we asked this question. The question wording was, we should have a strong leader who does not have to bother about elections. We should have a strong leader who does not have to bother about elections. Subsequently, we realized that the wording of the question was still problematic, because not bother about elections means what? But anyway, we asked this question, and we found that those who initially said that they uphold democracy as the ideal and most suitable form of government, among them, 31% agreed with this statement that we should have a strong leader who is not bothered by elections. So obviously there seems to be a constituency, a small group of people, though they are outnumbered by those who disagree with it. There is a group of people, or was a group of people 20 years ago, who believed in this craving for a strong leader, and that craving is always there. Subsequently, just before the latest divine incarnation happened in 2014, we asked a question in 2013. In 2013, we asked this question: we should get rid of parliament and elections and have a strong leader to decide things. And now we will realize why Mr. Narendra Modi got elected in 2014, because when we asked this question in 2013, whether you agree that we should get rid of parliament and elections and have a strong leader to decide things, 39% people agreed. And this time the balance was tilted in favor of those who agree. 39 agreed and 36 disagreed. So that is where we had come by 2013. This time around, in the national election study of 2024, we thought that these abstract questions about strong leader probably don't work well. They mislead the people, because who doesn't like a strong leader? So we asked a more specific question. We said, do you agree that once leaders are elected, there is no need to have constitution, courts and other checks? Once leaders are elected, there is no need to have other checks further. Once elected, you can do whatever you like. That is what the government is currently doing. This time around, 27 agreed against 58 who disagree. So to the specific question, whether leaders should be given a carte blanche, the support is less but sizable. We must admit that there is a small sizable group, something like 27%, 1/4. 1 in every 4 persons seems to be attracted to this idea that once leaders are elected, they should be free to do what they want. Obviously, this is a failure of our overall public training of what democracy means. Because in this, democracy has come to mean that once you are elected, for the next 2, 3, 4 or 5 whatever years, you have a mandate. And this idea of mandate, incidentally, you will find, is very popular in media. The moment somebody is elected with 1 vote difference, everyone starts talking about, but there is a people's mandate. Elections in a democracy don't give mandates. They give you permission to rule according to the law for the next specified period. Only when there is a referendum or something of that kind, you can claim to have a mandate. When you face the electorate saying that tomorrow I will abolish the Constitution of India, and you are elected, then you might say that I have the mandate to abolish this Constitution. Till then, the architecture of our state powers is such that you have a Constitution, and elections as part of that Constitution only tell you that you can do only this much with these many riders. ही सगळी बंधनं आहेत. एवढाच काळ आहे. आणि ह्या सगळ्या मर्यादांमध्ये तुम्हाला या गोष्टी करता येतील एवढंच निवडणुका सांगतात. त्यामुळे हे जे थोतांड आहे मॅन्डेट नावाचं, ते आपल्या पब्लिक डिस्कोर्समधनं, सार्वजनिक चर्चा विश्वामधनं जर गेलं तर निवडून आलेला माणूस किंवा पदाधिकारी किंवा सत्ताधारी काहीही करू शकतो. पालकमंत्री त्या जिल्ह्याचा राजा असतो. अशासारख्या ज्या सोयीस्कर कल्पना आपल्या लोकशाहीत आपण करून घेतलेल्या आहेत, खासदारांना निधी देण्याची वेडगळ कल्पना आपल्या लोकशाहीमध्ये जी आपण स्वीकारलेली आहे, त्या सगळ्या मग बाजूला जातील आणि आपल्याला लोकशाही हाती लागू शकेल. बट दॅट डझंट हॅपन. वी हॅव क्रिएटेड दिस एंटायर एडिफिस ऑफ wrong notions of what democracy means, as a result of which 1 out of every 4 persons today seems to be inclined that once elected, you don't require further checks and restrictions. However, let me also tell you before I turn to the next part, these 27% don't have any specific social profile. म्हणजे हे समाजाच्या कुठल्या अमुक एका वर्गातनं आलेत का 27% लोक, तर नाही. द सोशल प्रोफाईल इज डिफ्यूज. दे कम फ्रॉम डिफरंट सोशल सेक्शन्स. अपर मिडल लोअर क्लासेस, backward castes, traditionally upper castes or forward castes, different parts of the country, etc. In a sense, this is good news that there is no solid constituency of those who believe in this. But it is also a bad news in the sense that with this diffuse support, if, as I am now going to tell you in a minute, a strong supply mechanism begins to supply you with bulldozer ideas, there would be many more takers across the society because it then becomes an attractive idea. Let us therefore turn more to supply side of this bulldozer governance rather than merely focusing on this question of whether people are responsible. I would say yes, there is a certain sizable demand for bulldozer governance which can easily be appropriated and used as an energy for politics of a certain kind, which is being done presently. But that means that therefore there is a need to also have a very strong supply side to this bulldozer governance. There has to be somebody who is designing this supply very regularly and systematically, both politically and theoretically, for people to say that yes, we want an unhindered leader. Anyone who understands public opinion even cursorily would know that we don't have opinions inherent in us. I am not born with opinions. My opinions are formed through a process of socialization, and therefore it's a function of what kind of politics is happening around, who my leaders are, what they are telling me, how they are asking me to behave, and so on and so forth. So let us look at this supply side. On a small scale, this supply like demand is always there. You have a sundry MLA who actually specializes in going to government offices and browbeating government officers. And then he becomes a popular MLA because newspapers would flash his conquests. That XYZ MLA went to the Talati or Tehsildar office and beat up the Tehsildar. He becomes a kind of hero locally. There are also maverick police officers and administrators. In spite of the so-called steel frame that India wanted to create, etc., there are mavericks. You in Mumbai did have a maverick some 30 years ago, I guess, who would go on demolishing. So there are maverick public officers. They generally become popular. They are invited to social gatherings, cultural functions, etc. Sometimes some of them contest elections and ultimately fade away. But this small granular existence of supply of bulldozer governance is always there. In spite of the Indian Police Academy and what it teaches, I don't know what they teach. They supposedly teach constitution there at Hyderabad. But in spite of that, there are police officers at the IPS cadre also who think that strong arm techniques matter and they help. That will always happen in any society. However, we could have easily ignored that supply if there were no strong supply of bulldozer governance, which India suddenly started having in 2014. But to be fair, I must also say that strong leaders is not something very new to Indian politics. The only difference is that strong leaders always sort of promise two things. One is they promise you of what one can describe as gifts, benign gifts. And they also sometimes promise you with divine punishments. The earlier breed of strong leaders were famous for their benign gifts. If you look at the slogans of N.T. Ramarao, M.G. Ramachandran, all strong leaders in their own right, and actually strong in the sense that they wielded extraordinary power. They wielded extra constitutional power also, yes, but they wielded it mainly in order to distribute benign gifts. Jayalalitha then also followed in the footsteps of this genre, but came close to also using the stick. The other All India example that would come to mind obviously is that of Indira Gandhi between 1970 and 73, when she constituted the supply side in a sense. But if you look at the politics of India then, and even the politics of her dilapidated Congress party, you will find that there were far too many restrictions on Indira Gandhi internally, and the bureaucracy was much more strong then to have resisted at least partly what she designed or wanted. As a result of which, she actually had to switch off and trespass democratic thresholds subsequently. So I would say that in spite of these past examples, we didn't really have in India a full-fledged supply side of bulldozer governance until this language of Har Ghar or Ek Akela became popular. And it became popular through engineering, it became popular through manufacturing. So it has become popular. We have come to believe, many well-thinking people also have come to believe, economists particularly have come to believe that something great has happened to India in 2014. Since then, though earlier also we had the names of Indira Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru to the various schemes, the personal guarantee of a leader for any government scheme was not heard earlier. Now we have a personal guarantee of the leader, which then means that there is a complete supply of bulldozer. You may ask, but where is the bulldozer? There has not been a divine punishment. And I would say that we don't know that there is a divine punishment because those punishments were sold as master strokes. There at least have been two divine punishments that this country has undergone in the last 10 years. Massive divine punishments. One, demonetization, and two, lockdown. In both cases, as we have defined earlier, there was no prior legislative approval. In both cases, there was never complete judicial scrutiny. In both cases, there was not even a proper legal architecture available. Lockdown was imposed, God knows under which clause of the course. Unless, of course, you go back to the plague period and use the law that time and use it, but that was for the states and not for the union. So all definitions of this bulldozer governance that we deployed initially tell us that these two things fit, that the executive did those things because the executive thought that they were great things. The executive did these things without any internal scrutiny. The executive did these things without any judicial intervention. subsequently a very tame judicial intervention in the case of demonetization though, but otherwise generally indulgence. As I said earlier, the judiciary simply indulged as far as these two massive bulldozer actions were concerned. So we talk of bulldozers of the UP Chief Minister and the MP Chief Minister, forgetting that a larger umbrella bulldozer governance has already obtained and has come into being and is supplying ideas of bulldozer governance to this country, to this public, to its citizens and to its politics. Let me now turn more elaborately for a minute to the judiciary, since we have talked of the judiciary already. Bulldozer governance cannot become possible unless there is judicial approval, or if a bad word is to be used, collusion, participation. And that is what has happened increasingly over the past decade and so. What has happened in the past decade? As a constitutional scholar has said, India's judiciary has become the executive court. And since I am talking of the judiciary, I will quote the constitutional scholar rather than say it myself, because otherwise sometimes the judiciary becomes very strong when it comes to contempt cases. So here is the quote from Gautam Bhatia for your information. So go and file cases against him. He says that executive courts means an institution that speaks the language of the executive and has become indistinguishable from the executive. That is the executive court. He goes further to say that sometimes this executive court becomes executive's court, apostrophe S. म्हणजे कार्यकारी मंडळ बनणं कोर्टाने, न्यायमंडळाने ही एक अवस्था झाली आणि कार्यकारी मंडळाचं न्यायमंडळ बनणं, त्याचं हस्तक असलेलं न्यायमंडळ बनणं ही दुसरी अवस्था झाली, एक्झिक्युटिव्ह कोर्ट. What is executive court? He says it becomes an institution where executive ideology is laundered as judicially declared truth. म्हणजे कार्यकारी मंडळाची जी काही विचार करण्याची पद्धत आहे ती धुवून स्वच्छ करून कायद्याच्या भाषेत ज्युडिशियली डिक्लेअर्ड ट्रूथ म्हणजे न्यायालयाने जाहीर केलेलं सत्य म्हणून लोकांपुढे मांडली जाते, जगापुढे मांडली जाते, तेव्हा ते न्यायमंडळ हे कार्यकारी मंडळाचं न्यायमंडळ बनलेलं असतं. अँड देन ही गिव्स एक्झाम्पल्स फ्रॉम दी रूलिंग्स ऑफ जस्टिस A.M. खानविलकर अँड अदर जजेस. We need not go into that. If you are interested, you can find it out anywhere, but particularly in his unsealed covers. It is through this jurisprudence that the judiciary has almost approved the idea, which I mentioned earlier, that you are guilty until proven innocent. This idea, though not in so many words, has come about mainly in this phase of executive court. Now you will find that when the judiciary is talking the executive's language, and when the executive is when the legislature is also doing the executive's bidding, we have a full-fledged bulldozer governance. So it is no more now a question of just a few chief ministers doing something extraordinary, but the entire system behaving in an extraordinary and probably extra-constitutional manner. Even then I would say that perhaps things could be retrieved, stopped, if supply were limited only to these. But then supply side is also stronger because in the realm of ideas, in the realm of intellectual justifications, particularly in the realm of media presentations, all these things are bandied as great. If you watch Indian language media, not just Hindi, but particularly Hindi, you will realize that probably more than the executionists of this bulldozer governance, the media is actually much more excited and a strong supporter, supplier of these ideas and legitimator of those ideas. No wonder, therefore, that in our National Election Study 2024, we found that approval for strong leader comes mainly from those, or to put it in a technical language, you are more likely to approve a strong leader if you have high exposure to media. And you know, we are all subjects to that high exposure. So higher the exposure to media, higher the likelihood that you would support strong leader uncontrolled and ungoverned by anyone. That is what our findings of 2024 suggests. So the more you watch television, and obviously the consumption of television in English is insignificant, so you can forget about it, though it is not exception to what I am saying, but particularly in other Indian languages, if you watch the media, consume the media, both mainstream media, other media, new social media, whatever kinds of media, then you are more likely to be in favor of strong leader uncontrolled by restrictions. That is what I called the supply side. If you read newspaper articles carefully, for example, on Yogi Adityanath, by the way, on Yogi Adityanath, and he is called Bulldozer Baba, so there are very popular Hindi YouTube songs. So if you don't want to later on read my lecture, you can listen to that set of music. Quoting that music of Bulldozer Bababu, quoting those songs, one political scientist who is really famous and impartial, based in Uttar Pradesh, who does field work, etc., says in one of his articles that media picks up whatever fits its imagination. In reality, people are not opposed to these bulldozers because they are not used against the poor or the minorities. This is in the print by Badri Narayan. So sophisticated intellectual arguments, and of course I am sure now more sophisticated intellectual arguments would come about what democracy means. Because very recently I came across this reference about Bangladesh developments. One intellectual turned journalist, turned intellectual, turned BJP politician says in one of his pieces that democracy has to be given in doses. That's exactly what the British were saying in the 19th century. Lord Ripon and others were saying this. Now, in the name of decolonization, a BJP intellectual says that you have to give democracy in doses. This is the kind of supply that is now going to arise. That India was always a democracy because it believed in democracy in doses. And of course, strong leaders are required because they do great service to mankind. That intellectual arguments, media, culture, and you know so that fantasy is already there. But now we are past fantasy, and now we are depicting in the films reality, which is a parallel reality, which industry has now emerged more recently. With this industry which has now emerged, Kerala files, Kashmir files, these files, those files, with this industry, the supply side is likely to become more culturally strong than ever. So at this moment in India, what I am arguing is that we arrive at a moment when all things sort of culminate. That a towering leader emerges, he retains his popularity over a time, that the media sort of goes berserk, that the judiciary forgets its constitutionally ordained duty, and that intellectuals also join the bandwagon, which they always do in any case. they join the bandwagon. So the role of the intellectuals is generally to join the bandwagon, which they are doing now, and therefore that will happen. My argument therefore would be that while we should be concerned with the demand part of this bulldozer governance, let us identify the supply part of bulldozer governance to understand how and why of bulldozer governance. Let me now come to the concluding part. What does this all mean? In a sense, theoretically what is happening is that India's constitution invested the state authority with power. And the idea was that it should be power to do certain things. You know, in political science classes, we always try to decipher this poetry about India's constitution being a transformatory document and welfare document. Why is it so? Because it invests the state with power to do things. The elite here, and in the term elite, I am including not just the politicians, but also the bureaucratic elite, the governing elite, the experts, technocrats, and intellectuals. All these converted this idea of power to do something into power over someone. That transformation has been, in a sense, central to this transformation that the past 10 years have successfully brought about. These 10 years obviously did not come out of a vacuum. So I am not arguing that this has happened suddenly because of 2014. I am saying that we need to put it in context, and that context theoretically is this: the complete hijacking by this elite of this country of the idea of what the constitution means. That's one. The second thing which I must touch upon before I conclude is, what do you call this animal? Bulldozer governance is an animal already in existence. It is the elephant in the room. What do you call it? You might say, well, you might call it bulldozer democracy, but that is not enough, because unless somebody from North America calls it bulldozer democracy, it won't be accepted as a proper terminology. So I tried to look at various possibilities, and I realized that one of the attractive possibilities now making round globally to describe this phenomenon is illiberal democracy. Particularly Farid Zakaria has popularized this from his original article in 1997, and more recently Milan Vaishnav, writing about 2024 India, has said that India has entered that phase. It's an elegant argument, but I have problems with that argument. The problem is that it's not a question of liberalism in the classical sense as it emerged in the West. That is not what democracy is associated with. Democracy is associated with the idea that we are individual citizens. The idea of citizen is central to democracy, and therefore individual is central, not individualism. Let us make a distinction between these two. Once we have made that distinction, it becomes clear that it is not just liberalism which is being attacked, because in India there is this decolonization industry on behalf of BJP, which is arguing that this is a baggage from the West. That is not the case. If I am to be a voter, then I also need to have certain personality and authority as a voter. That personality and authority is coming through the constitution, not through Western liberalism. It doesn't come from Western liberalism. The language might be English and therefore might sound to be Western liberalism, but this idea is thoroughly native. Just go back 125 years and read Phule, for example, and suddenly you will find that he is talking of the individual. In the writings of Mahatma Phule, and he is probably, to my mind, the first Indian intellectual activist who pinpoints this idea that for democracy you need individual, and for democracy you need equality. There is no question of liberalism here. This is all homegrown. Ambedkar studied elsewhere, but spoke the language of this country and its requirements. And therefore, if we want democracy, then that democracy would require certain things which the constitution provides and which are under attack, Therefore, merely having elections is not enough for democracy. Even merely having free and fair elections is not enough, because the real fair in free and fair elections would mean that everyone would have an equal status politically at least, if not otherwise. And therefore, the idea of democracy, in short, hinges fundamentally on this superiority of the citizens over their rulers. For that, you need this paraphernalia which the Constitution gives you, provides you. If you disagree with it, then you say that we don't agree with democracy at all. But don't say that it is an illiberal democracy, because without these individual rights and statuses, there can't be democracy in the first place. Therefore, I am not sure what this bulldozer governance means. Let me then come to the just last part of this lecture. Friends, this means that on the one hand, we have this question mark, the puzzle, as to what to call it. And the labeling, the naming game is always important, because by the way you name something, you actually understand it. So if you say that this is the truncated democracy that we are having, then you understand that there is something which is cut in this democracy, cut adrift in this democracy. And that is the moment. In a sense, this is a moment of melancholy. This is a moment of sadness. And this moment of melancholy perhaps is not unique to India. This moment of melancholy about democracy is, in a sense, currently a global phenomenon. Unfortunately for democracy, but fortunately for India, there are now comparables, because the melancholy of democracy is a global phenomenon. Everywhere these questions about strong leaders are being asked, and strong leaders don't happen only in the non-Western countries, they happen everywhere. They happen even in the West sometimes. Not only that, but more than India, support for this idea of strong leader is increasing in many smaller West European countries as well. Trespassing the constitution is not something that happens only in India. Mr. Donald Trump did that when he lost elections. So this is a global phenomenon, that democracy, which was on an ascendance in the 20th century, has suddenly experienced a downfall, and India, through its own pathway, seems to be participating in this moment of melancholy. Let us not rejoice, therefore, in this point, that anyway all over the world this is happening. Let us ask finally this question: what can India then tell to the world? And I guess from our experience, at least one thing that India can tell the world for democracy theorization is that democracies break down through implosion. And they break down mainly because of that implosion caused by inner supply that democracy really faces or confronts. If we contributed to that theorization, we would also have contributed to our own understanding, which is that in India, if we find democracy being cut adrift from different sides and truncated from different ways, it is mainly a long process, and a process mainly hastened by the current moment, and therefore its address or its redressal is also in the redressal of the current moment, as well as in the long-term redressal of the trends that endanger democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that lecture, wonderful lecture. Now we invite the chair to give his comments.
The renowned scholar Suhas Palshikar, Irfan of the Asghar Engineer Foundation, Ram Punyani, who is the president of that organization, and many serious-minded audience here to discuss the crisis of democracy in India in the form of bulldozer democracy. My job is at one level very simple, because Suhas, in his 65-minute speech, has opened so many windows for us to introspect and also think aloud as to what is happening to us collectively as a country, as a society, and also individually, how are we responding to it. So since he has opened so many windows, I will not be able to deal with all the aspects that he dealt with. And therefore, I will limit myself to some of his observations, continuation of his observations, or make my own great wisdom to you for you to think. Well, actually, he raised one important question as how we arrived here, wherever we have arrived in that bulldozer democracy. And he very correctly said it is not a question of merely physical bulldozer demolishing your house or institution. In Banaras, they destroyed and demolished the Sarvodaya Seva Sangh office without taking into account any constitutional or any public protest or any civil society response. They demolished Sarvodaya Society organization. So he raised the question, how did we arrive here? That's a very, very fundamental question. That question can be raised in a different format. Like, were we like this all the time? Was our democracy always very fragile? How did we come from Nehruvian era to Modi era? For Narendra Modi, Nehruvian era and Modi era is just a continuation in the Trimurti Bhavan. For him, from Nehru to Modi, there is no difference. There are so many prime ministers. So all prime ministers are equal. And anybody will say, after all, prime ministers were elected by the legal process, by the constitutional process, by the electoral process. So obviously all prime ministers are equal. Therefore, there is nothing wrong in equating Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Narendra Modi. But I would raise a slightly different, contrarian question in respect to how did we arrive here. I don't know how many of you remember, but the demand for so-called hard right-wing party in India. Hard right-wing party in India is needed because the polity in India is dominated by the left, condemned sometimes as Nehruvian left. And that Nehruvian left is actually in command, and therefore the right has not really grown. This was not argument only of the Swatantra party. It was argument of many so-called, or actually, liberal intellectuals, I don't want to take name, but if you have access to newspapers on the net, you will find in 2012 and 2013, the renowned liberal intellectuals writing in Indian Express, saying that time has come for us to have a genuine right-wing party and a strong leadership. The point he raised of strong leadership was demanded by the liberals in many newspapers, not only in many newspapers, in many civil society organizations. I am not concerned why they condemn Manmohan Singh. I am not here to defend UPA 2 or UPA 1. But suddenly they start today discussing that the old world has gone. Old world, which old world? Manmohan Singh's old world? Indira Gandhi's old world? Rajiv Gandhi's old world? Nehru's old world? Which old world? All these liberal intellectuals who were writing in Indian Express profoundly and eloquently, today are regretting that they did so. Publicly they are regretting. I do not want to name them. They are truly very, very profound scholars, some coming from US and some from here, including from Ashoka University. So the question is, how did we arrive here? Between 2012 or even before that, in 2011, when the so-called Anna Hazare's agitation took place in the name of anti-corruption, many of these liberal intellectuals were in the forefront of going to Anna Hazare and defending. And who were all going? The CPI, the CPM, the socialists were shoulder to shoulder with Arun Jaitley and others, saying that this is not on, this is 2011. In 2013, this sound was even louder. After the third successive election of Narendra Modi in Gujarat, these people started. Some of them have contributed to the manifesto of 2014 BJP, these liberal intellectuals. And that's how Modi comes in 2014. Otherwise, I will just ask a simple rider. How much time I am supposed to speak? No, I can speak almost for 1 hour, which I don't want to do. The point that must be made and must be remembered is that 2009 election. I'm not arguing for or anti-Congress, I'm just giving you some facts. In 2009, Congress secured 206 seats. 206 seats. And BJP secured, I think, 118 or some such seats. Only 5 years later, only 5, 2009, 2014, 206 seats of Congress came to just 44 seats. And BJP came from 118 to 282 seats. Just 5 years. What happened between 2009 and 2014 that the disillusionment with Manmohan Singh government, UPA 2, was so much that from 206, Congress was brought to 44. And Modi, what was this sudden affection, sudden infatuation with Narendra Modi, which brought the BJP from 118 to 282, the single largest party for the first time, forming its own majority after 1989. Why nobody has asked this question? And this is because between 2009 and 2014, so much has happened which I don't want to describe except what I mentioned about Anna Hazare, who was supported by left, right and the liberals. And 2014 changed, and till for first 6 to 8 months, even 1 year, very, very few, hardly any actually, intellectuals or scholars or politicians or pundits or even media persons thought that this is going to be a monster in Indian politics. We talk about bulldozing. Having been in Rajya Sabha for 6 years, what he said is correct. Bulldozer is not only physical. Modi is a personification of bulldozer. He is a personal bulldozer. He bulldozes everything. He bulldozes his cabinet. He bulldozes parliament. All of us were suspended when those all related to crime were passed. Nearly 150 MPs were suspended, Lok Sabha 146, and of all entire opposition, not only Congress. And how much was the strong public opposition to that kind of suspension and passing laws? How much? In market, nothing. Media didn't say anything? No. Media just submitted totally, surrendered. Media did not take any action on any subject. I'll just give you another bulldozer, which he mentioned also. In 2016, and this is now on record, in 2016 when he announced demonetization on TV, he had brought the entire cabinet in one room. Modi brought entire cabinet in one room, and this is on record. Arun Jaitley as well as Arvind Subramaniam have said it. And nobody knew why entire cabinet has been called in that room. He said, I am going to make a major announcement on TV and you will hear it here. So they were supposed to hear the demonetization announcement right in that room when Modi announced it to the rest of the world, making 1,500 rupees notes equal to Raddi. Even Arun Jaitley did not know. When we asked Arvind Subramaniam in Nehru Center seminar, he said, well, only he did it. We asked him, but you were the economic advisor. So did he not consult you? He said once in some strange way he had said, how do you respond to demonetization? But he did not know that demonetization was to come. After, of course, that so-called discussion with him, it was 1 year before. Raghuram Rajan had resigned, Urjit Patel had later on problems. So Reserve Bank governors are gone. Arvind Subramaniam, economic advisor, then he told us when we asked him, but he didn't consult anybody in the cabinet. He said he doesn't need to consult because he knows everything. He knows everything, as all of you know. He dictated the date of Chandrayaan, first Chandrayaan, which failed. He dictated the date of Chandrayaan launch, which failed. He dictated the term and the time of new parliament building. I was there. He actually dictated that, and that's why it is leaking from all over now. I have seen the leakages, I was there. I have come only a couple of months ago. He dictated that I want Ram Mandir to be ready on 22nd January. Now it is leaking. So Ram Mandir is leaking, that parliament is leaking, that Chandrayaan has failed. And he had said, if you recall, after demonetization, that if you prove that I have done wrong and crime, you hang me anywhere, these are his words, you hang me anywhere in the public square. Forget hanging, media did not even open the topic. As media is so horribly panicked and afraid, media did not show even poor Fogart's protest in Delhi. Not only that, media did not pay tribute to her for gaining that silver which is not given, and media did not raise any question about Fogart's arrival on international scene of Olympics. Media is afraid of Fogart. Media is afraid of everybody. Whoever challenges Modi, media is afraid of. Media must not touch the subjects which will hurt Modi. And that is why we must realize that the bulldozers have been allowed to operate right from Delhi, cabinet onwards. Not only in 2017 is arrival of Yogi Adityanath. Before that, the bulldozer called Narendra Modi started operating, and not only that, I will further tell you, I'm more a journalist than a parliamentarian. She introduced me as a politician. I'm not in that sense of the politician. In Goa, when Modi's candidature was declared as a prime ministerial candidate, that itself was bulldozed by Modi. And now there are records available. Yashwant Sinha has spoken about it. Advani has not spoken about it, but everybody knows. Sushma Swaraj spoke about it. Modi's name was not on the top list. Modi's name was brought on the top list by first removing Nitin Gadkari from the second term of the president which was proposed, making Rajnath Singh, and forcing Rajnath Singh. That was done by Modi. Modi's gangs were there in that hall, in different corners of the hall, and they started shouting immediately when the meeting began, Modi, 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 we want Modi, Modi, Modi as Prime Minister. And when we asked Rajnath Singh, but how did you allow? He said, 4 of us were there, not only me. He said, you don't realize I had just become president of the party a couple of months ago, and if I had not allowed that, his candidature, party would have been split. And I would have been blamed that within 3 months of my coming as president, I split the party, I allowed the party split to take place. So blame will be on me, the sin will be, I will be the person who committed the sin. And otherwise, there was going to be a big ruckus, perhaps riot in Goa, if Modi's name was not announced as a candidate for prime ministership. So bulldozing begins earlier. And if I may take, sorry to say, contrarian view of referring some back references as to whether we have in our DNA some kind of authoritarianism. How many of you remember that no less a person but Jayaprakash Narayan said in 1968 that what India needs is Ayub Khan style governance? I don't know how many of you remember. It was JP who said in 1968. Forget that. That is too old a story and it can unnecessarily generate arguments. But what all of us know was in 1974, when the agitation took place in Gujarat, forcing assembly to be dissolved, which was elected only 1 year or a few months before, Jayaprakash agreed. Assembly to be dissolved. Mrs. Gandhi refused to dissolve. She said, "We did just elected now. What is the occasion to dissolve? Because there are people on the streets, only section of the people on the streets. You want me to dissolve Gujarat Assembly?" If you remember, she was attacked by stones, she was hurt, injured, carried this stone injury. And then Moraji went on hunger strike, indefinite hunger strike. And then many congressmen from Gujarat and elsewhere told Mrs. Gandhi, look, if Moraji dies, like in Andhra, Ramalu died in 1956, it will be a big blow to our human approach to politics. So let not Moraji die. Let us dissolve the assembly. So assembly was dissolved. There was no Modi. Agitation was led later on by no less but Jayaprakash Narayan, who in Sundrabai Hall, I was present as a reporter of the Economic Times. I think Kalpana will remember. Who in Sundrabai Hall said that let us not consider RSS a pariah. Let us not isolate them. They should be part of the mainstream politics to defend and promote democratic forces. That was in Sundrabai Hall. If I am not mistaken, another person on the dais was Palkiwala. So, what are we talking about? If we are referring to the old aspects of how bulldozers came to power, and yet, despite all that, bulldozers did not acquire power after Nehru died, after Shastri died, after Indira Gandhi died, after Rajiv Gandhi died. Bulldozers acquired power only in 2014. That shows that India may have had, like, we also have bad cholesterol and good cholesterol and all that, so we must be having bad cholesterol of some dictatorial tendencies and bulldozing tendencies ever since 1947, maybe. In fact, Ambedkar has warned for that in his constitutional speech. So maybe they were there, but they were controlled. They did not rise so much that they came to power. In 1990, Advani started Rath Yatra and withdrew support of the government of VP Singh because Rath Yatra was stopped by Lalu in Samastipur. That time, BJP was opposed to Mandal Commission, which actually provoked the Rath Yatra on 22nd October 1990. And that time, Mandal was categorically opposed by Narendra Modi and BJP. Today, they are the advocates of Mandalization. Modi quotes very often VP Singh and Mandal, saying that it is the democratization of Hindu society. So Advani, who opposed, BJP, who opposed Mandal, today are advocating, and suddenly they say, in fact, many of the BJP candidates in the election demanding tickets now are saying, "अरे मुझे नहीं टिकट मिलेगा, क्यों? अरे मैं साला ब्राह्मण हूँ ना, हमारी पार्टी में आजकल ब्राह्मण को बहुत कम वैल्यू है." And for all the progressives, RSS was a Brahmin party. Now Modi always takes pride in publicly saying that he is OBC. Actually is not, but that is a different thing. That's a separate story. Just as his degree is fake, his caste is also fake. So that is not our discussion today. The point is, all this started, this fakery, post-truth, fake truth. And here in Harkishan Das Hospital, Narendra Modi inaugurates Science and Medical Conference. In front, the audience is surgeons, doctors, top-class medical practitioners. And Modi tells them Kauravas were genetics engineering was there, and doctors listening. Then they said there was plastic surgery, and Ganpati's head is a proof of plastic surgery there, doctors listening, surgeons listening, plastic surgeons also listening. Then somebody asked him after the event, but if plastic surgery was there, they should have put original head on Ganpati. Why poor Hathi should be killed? If the plastic surgery was so advanced in those days. But doctors succumbed, surgeons succumbed, academics succumbed, lawyers succumbed, media surrendered, media not only crawled, media prostrated. And this middle-class, educated intelligentsia has brought Modi to power. And I'll tell you, Suhas was right in his surveys when he quoted, irrespective of class, caste, and social status, they were demanding strong leader. True. I do not mind that statement. What do I mind is they demanding a strong leader, a peasant, a farmer, a Shet Mazur, is different thing than the liberal intellectuals and the media demanding a strong leader. Media and these people demanding strong leader is more dangerous than general public wanting a strong leader, which general public might want. And therefore, I think this middle-class so-called intelligentsia, the so-called educated, well-off intelligentsia, which is governed more by their hedonism, by shopping malls and Inox, they are the real supporters of Narendra Modi regime and bulldozer democracy. So let us not exonerate ourselves that, okay, it is Modi doing. We are responsible for Modi being there from 2010 onwards. Thank you very much.
I don't know whether we have time for question and answers. Two questions. Please identify yourself, be brief, just the question. Anybody? That mic is not working. Yeah, 1 and 2.
Thank you. My name is Raksha. I'm a journalist, and my question is for Professor Palshikar. So at the end of your lecture, you mentioned that since since this is the time when so many factors have come together, you know, for us to enable bulldozer governance, this is also the time that we need to come together to dismantle it in a sense. I just wanted to ask you, by taking your own example, that successive governments have actually kind of furthered the trend towards authoritarianism. So you mentioned TADA, but there's Makoka, there's TADA, there's POTA, successive amendments of UAPA, and this has happened under different governments. So what gives you the sense that for us to kind of dismantle the bulldozer governance at this point is possible at all?
On your question, there are two things that need to be dismantled. The first thing that needs to be dismantled is the idea that democracy can live with bulldozer governance. And that's a larger challenge. So obviously that cannot be done overnight, that cannot be done in just 1 year, and it would have to be a larger civil social movement. On the other hand, I also believe, and I can speak about that at length later whenever opportunity permits me, I didn't speak about it today, that movements are exploited by certain political agencies. And to the extent they are exploited by certain political agencies, it becomes incumbent to also initially attack those agencies in order to reach to the movement and then dismantle it. It is in this sense that a double dismantling is involved. To the second dismantling, you might ask me, how is it possible if other parties are also complicit in it? I think in the destruction of the current agency, there would be a lesson for other parties that this doesn't work. You know, in a very small measure at least, though it is always said that Rahul Gandhi is more or less sort of circled by these fashionable Jolawalas, in spite of that, the Congress is probably realizing, though they won't admit it, and from what the chairperson said, you will realize that they won't admit, that emergency was a problem, number one. Number two, they have realized that so-called anti-terror laws are like what is mythically called a bhasmasur. Because then it turns against you at one point of time. You create it for others, you never know when it will turn to you. And therefore the thinking within the new Congress at a very weak and very disorganized level is changing. State parties are tough to change because it is their staple to have bulldozer governance. And therefore the real attack will have to be against state parties of like TMC or like now BRS, TRS earlier, YSR, CP and so on and so forth. And therefore it's a long kind of haul. On the overseas Indians, my quick answer would be money is their one contribution and intellectual support is their second contribution. One has to live with it, one has to fight with it, one has to counter it. But the moment they get voting rights also, things can become more complicated. You know, because there is a strong movement to give voting rights, dual citizenship and whatnot. And then you will have probably an overseas India constituency which will overwhelm this so-called subaltern constituency in this country. I don't have anything to say on right to recall. It is a poetry, mainly. It doesn't work. That is not how democracy works, theoretically. But in addition to that, the scale and practicality questions are equally daunting. But I am not arguing this case on the question of scale and logistics, but on the question of what representation means. And if you elect a representative, then the representative is a representative, so calling him or her back would also require a very complicated process of creating a counter representation, and that is why right to recall is an oxymoron.
Thank you. My name is Mirza. I'm a researcher from Assam. You started off with the explanation from Tada. You know, I just wanted to make an observation here that in 1958 the Armed Forces Special Powers Act came in Nagaland, and I think entire geographies were bulldozed. And what we see in Manipur today, the actions that are being done by the government, the ruling government there, is also quite a long way in what started then. So I think that is also something that we also have to constantly remind ourselves, that entire geographies have been, bulldozed at some point of time, which is a part of life now there.
Hello. Yeah. My name is Samir. So I have a related question. We talk about bulldozer governance for the executive and legislature. What about bulldozer decision making from mobocracy? So for example, what has happened in Bangladesh, where elected government, whether fairly or not, was pushed out by a mob, right? And what is happening in West Bengal, where a narrative is being created, where people come on the street, and there are mechanisms for elections. You are bypassing those elections. So how do you react to that?
Both difficult questions in a sense, but thank you for mentioning AFSPA, because I simply could not include everything in the list, like for example the use of FCRA more recently.